There is one day every single week that the church has quietly set apart for nearly 2,000 years, and most Catholics walk straight through it without a second thought. Not Sunday, not a feast day, Friday. Long before anyone wrote it into canon law, the first Christians already understood something instinctively in their bones the day their Lord was condemned. Scourged and crucified could not simply become an ordinary day again. So every Friday, week after week, generation after generation, the church has asked her children to remember, through fasting, through penance, through small, deliberate acts of self-denial, what was purchased for them on Calvary. This coming Friday, July 10th, 2026, is one of those days, an ordinary Friday, which, as we're about to see, is not ordinary at all. I'm going to give you 5 things today. Not private revelations, not speculation, not something I'm inventing to sound dramatic. 5 ordinary, sound, centuries-old Catholic practices that you can live out this Friday. Practices that, if you actually take them seriously, will change how every Friday for the rest of your life feels to you. Stay with me through all 5, because the 5th one is the one most Catholics have quietly forgotten exists at all. And it used to be considered by the Church's own tradition the most important of the 5. If you only take one thing from this video, I want it to be that last one. But we have to build up to it properly. So let's start at the beginning. Let's be precise because precision matters when we're talking about the actual discipline of the Church, not vague sentiment. Canon 1250 of the Code of Canon Law states plainly that all Fridays throughout the year, not just during Lent, along with the entire season of Lent itself, are penitential days for the universal church. Canon 1251 goes further. Abstinence from meat or from some other food determined by the local bishop's conference is to be observed on all Fridays unless a solemnity happens to fall on that day. I want to pause on that because I think most Catholics under a certain age have never actually heard it stated this directly. Somewhere in the last 60 years, a rumor took hold, an informal word of mouth rumor that Friday penance was abolished after the Second Vatican Council. It wasn't. What actually happened is this: in many countries, including the United States, the bishops granted the faithful permission to substitute another act of penance or charity in place of abstaining from meat outside of Lent. That's a real and legitimate provision. But notice what it does not say. It does not say the obligation to observe Friday as a penitential day was lifted. It only changed the form that penance could take outside of Lent. The underlying obligation, do something every Friday in remembrance of the Passion, has never gone away. So when I say there's an obligation most Catholics have quietly let slip through their fingers, this is exactly what I mean. Not because anyone rebelled against it, simply because in the absence of a strict rule, you must eat fish. An entire generation quietly stopped doing anything at all. The freedom to choose became, in practice, the freedom to choose nothing. Why does the Church care about this so much? Why build an entire standing weekly discipline around one day? Because Friday is the day Christ was crucified, not metaphorically, historically, actually, on a real Friday at a real hour outside the walls of a real city. And the Church, in her wisdom, decided that this event was too significant to be remembered only once a year on Good Friday, and then set aside for the other 51 weeks. Instead, she built the memory into the very rhythm of the week itself. Every single Friday becomes, in a small and personal way, a miniature Good Friday, not liturgically identical to it, nothing so dramatic as that, but spiritually oriented toward it. A standing weekly invitation to unite some small measure of your own life, your own discomfort, your own self-denial to what he endured. Think about what that means practically. It means the Church never intended for the Passion to live only in your memory as a historical fact you assent to intellectually. She built a rhythm into your life 52 times a year without fail, so that the Passion would remain something you actually do something about, not merely something you believe happened. This coming Friday, July 10th, isn't a special feast. There's no solemnity on the calendar that day. It's about as ordinary a Friday as you'll find all year, which is exactly why it's the perfect example to build this whole video around. Because if these 5 practices matter on an unremarkable Friday in the middle of July, they matter every single week, not only during Lent, not only on Good Friday, but always. So let's go through the 5 practices, one at a time, carefully. And as we go, I want you to actually decide, not just nod along, which of these you are going to commit to doing yourself this coming Friday. The first practice is the most traditional of the 5, and the one the Church has never stopped asking of us: abstain from meat, or if you're in a country where an alternative is permitted outside of Lent, offer some other genuine act of penance in its place. Now, I want to be honest about a trap here because I see people fall into it constantly. The bishop's permission to substitute another act was never meant to make Friday penance easier. It was meant to make it more personal, to let each believer choose a penance suited to their own life, rather than applying one blanket rule to everyone regardless of circumstance. But too often, I can choose something else, quietly becomes, I don't have to do anything, and that is precisely the drift the church never intended and never sanctioned. So if you choose to substitute something for abstinence from meat, choose something that actually costs you, not a symbolic gesture you'd have done anyway with no effort involved. A real fast from something screens alcohol, a particular comfort you reach for automatically. Skipping a meal entirely, if your health permits it, something that, when Friday afternoon comes and you feel the pinch of having given something up, reminds you why you're feeling that pinch. Here's the theology underneath this, and it matters. Penance is not self-punishment, and it is never meant to make God love you more. He already loves you infinitely, and nothing you do changes that. Penance is instead an act of love returned. It's the small physical way we say in our bodies and our habits, not just in our thoughts, I remember what this day cost you, and I want some real portion of my week, however small, to reflect that memory. There's an old spiritual principle worth holding on to here. We are not pure spirits, floating disconnected from our bodies. We are body and soul together, and the two are woven into each other more tightly than we usually notice. That's why the church has never simply said, just think about the Passion on Fridays. She has always paired the memory with a physical act, because a thought alone tends to evaporate by lunchtime. But a physical discipline felt in the body has a way of keeping the memory present all day long. I think of the old custom still kept in some households of a family setting a slightly simpler table on Fridays, nothing dramatic, just a quieter meal than the rest of the week, precisely so that the physical experience of the day, not just the intellectual awareness of it, marked it as different. That's the spirit behind this whole practice, not misery for its own sake. A small weekly reminder built into the body that this day is not like the others. Commit to this before Friday arrives. Decide now, not at noon on Friday itself, when the decision becomes harder because hunger or habit has already taken over. The second practice is one of the oldest and most beloved devotions in the entire life of the church. Pray the Stations of the Cross, even briefly, even imperfectly. Most Catholics associate the Stations exclusively with Lent. Friday evenings in a dimly lit parish, walking from station to station behind a priest carrying a small cross. That's a beautiful and venerable custom, and if your parish offers it, I'd encourage you strongly to go. But here's what most people don't realize. The Stations are not a seasonal decoration that gets covered up after Easter and forgotten until next Lent. Every Catholic church keeps all 14 Stations displayed, mounted on the walls, year-round, precisely so that any of the faithful on any Friday of the year can walk through them privately at their own pace whenever they choose. If you can get to a church on Friday, even for 15 minutes, walk the Stations yourself. You don't need a priest leading you. You don't need the full formal responses if you don't know them by heart. Simply stand before each image, the condemnation before Pilate, the first fall, meeting his mother, Simon of Cyrene forced to help carry the cross, Veronica wiping his face, the second fall, the women of Jerusalem, the third fall, the stripping of his garments, the crucifixion itself, his death, the descent from the cross, and finally the laying in the tomb. And simply hold your mind there for a moment at each one. Ask yourself, honestly, what that particular moment meant and what it might mean for whatever you happen to be carrying that week. If you genuinely cannot get to a parish, long work hours, family obligations, distance, a simple printed meditation booklet works just as well, or even a slow, deliberate walk through the 14 stations in your own mind, station by station, without any book at all. What matters isn't the format. What matters is that you deliberately place the actual historical events of the Passion in front of your attention, on purpose rather than letting Friday slip past as background noise indistinguishable from Tuesday or Wednesday. I'd encourage you to try this even once, this coming Friday, even if you've never done it outside of Lent before. People who take up this practice consistently describe something simple but real. The Passion stops being a story they know intellectually and starts becoming something they've actually walked through physically with their own feet and their own attention again and again until it becomes part of how they see the rest of their week. The third practice is older than most Catholics realize, and it takes less than a minute pause, if only briefly, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the hour the Gospels indicate as the hour of Christ's death, and offer a short, deliberate prayer. The Gospel of Matthew tells us that from the 6th hour to the 9th hour, noon to 3 in the afternoon, by our reckoning, darkness came over the whole land, and that at the 9th hour Jesus cried out and gave up his spirit. That hour, 3 o'clock, has been kept by the tradition as the hour of mercy, the moment the price of our redemption was fully paid. This is not a complicated devotion. You don't need to stop what you're doing for 20 minutes. Something as simple as spoken silently even in the middle of a workday, Lord Jesus, at this hour you gave up your spirit for me. I unite whatever I am carrying today to your cross. That's the whole practice. 30 seconds, maybe less. But here's why it matters more than its brevity suggests. Most of us move through Friday exactly like we move through any other weekday. Meetings, errands, deadlines, the ordinary friction of an ordinary life, with nothing at all marking the day as different, until suddenly it's evening and the day has passed entirely unremarked. A single deliberate pause at 3 o'clock breaks that pattern. It's a small hinge in the middle of the day that reorients everything around it. The morning becomes a lead up to that moment. The afternoon becomes shaped by having passed through it. Even a 30-second prayer, kept faithfully, has a way of coloring an entire day. If you're able to set a quiet reminder on your phone for 3 o'clock this Friday, do it. Not because you need the reminder to remember Christ suffered. You already know that intellectually. But because the whole point of this practice is to make that knowledge interrupt your actual afternoon, physically at the actual hour, rather than remaining a fact filed away somewhere you never visit. We're a little past the halfway point, and I want to stop for just a moment because I promised you at the start that the 5th practice is the one most Catholics have quietly let go of, and I haven't gotten there yet on purpose. The first 3 practices we've covered, penance, the stations, the 3 o'clock pause, are the practices most people, if they think about Friday devotion at all, would probably name. They're well known, even if under-used. The 4th and 5th are different. The 4th is well known in principle, but rarely done with any real specificity. The 5th is the one that has almost entirely disappeared from ordinary Catholic life, even though the tradition once treated it as central to the whole point of Friday observance. So stay with me. We're building toward it. The 4th practice, and one the Church explicitly recognizes as a legitimate way of keeping Friday penance a specific, concrete act of charity, not a vague good intention, but something particular, planned, and a little costly. Here's the distinction I want to draw, because it's easy to let this practice dissolve into nothing. Being kind on Friday is not the practice. Most of us try to be kind every day, with varying success, and that's simply ordinary Christian life. The practice here is more deliberate than that. Choose in advance one specific act of charity tied to that Friday, and actually carry it out. A visit to someone who is genuinely alone, not a phone call you'd have made anyway, but a visit you plan specifically because it's Friday and you want that day to carry a particular weight of self, gift. A meal brought to someone recovering from illness or grief. An hour of real, undivided attention given to a family member who rarely asks for it and has quietly stopped expecting it. Something owed, financially or otherwise, that you finally settle. A person you've been avoiding a conversation with whom you finally sit down and actually listen to. The theological logic here is direct and worth stating plainly. Good Friday itself was, in the fullest sense, an act of total self-gift. Christ withholding nothing, giving everything down to the last breath. A Friday act of charity is meant to be a small, real echo of that total gift, not a decorative gesture that costs us nothing. If the act of charity you choose doesn't cost you anything, time you'd rather spend elsewhere, comfort you'd rather keep, pride you'd rather protect, it likely isn't functioning as the kind of penance the Church has in mind when she permits charity as a substitute for abstinence. Choose one such act before Friday arrives. Not a general resolution to be nicer this week, something specific enough that you could describe it to another person and they'd know exactly what you did and for whom. And now, finally, the 5th practice, the one I told you at the start, has quietly disappeared from most Catholic households, even though it was once considered, by the tradition, the very heart of what Friday observance is for. A brief examination of conscience, specifically ordered toward the Passion, not the general nightly examen most of us are at least somewhat familiar with, but a sharper, more pointed set of questions asked specifically on Friday, and specifically in light of what that day commemorates. Here's why I place this last and why I consider it the most important of the 5. The first four practices, penance, the stations, the 3 o'clock pause, charity, are all in their own ways acts of remembrance and devotion. They orient your attention toward Christ's suffering. But none of them by themselves necessarily asks the harder question underneath all of it, what in my own life actually needed that suffering to be endured in the first place? That is the question the fifth practice asks directly, without softening it. Not a vague, generalized sense of being a sinner in the abstract, something more specific, where this week, was I unkind in a way I've already justified to myself rather than admitted? Who have I withheld forgiveness from quietly, while telling myself I've already let it go? What small, self-serving choices did I make this week that I would be uncomfortable naming out loud to another person? The tradition historically paired this kind of Friday self-examination directly with the other practices we've already covered. Penance and almsgiving were never meant to stand alone. Disconnected from actual self-knowledge. The logic runs in a specific order first. Examine honestly what in your life stands in need of healing. Then, in response, take up some real penance and some real act of charity, precisely because you've named something specific that needs addressing, rather than performing a generic ritual with nothing concrete behind it. This is not meant to produce guilt for guilt's sake, and I want to be careful here, because there's a real spiritual danger on the other side of this practice too. An anxious, scrupulous self-examination that spirals into despair rather than clarity. That is not what's being asked of you. The goal of this practice is honesty, not self-punishment. Christ's total innocence and total self-gift are held up in Catholic spirituality, not as a club to beat ourselves with, but as the standard by which grace is shown to actually be capable of transforming an ordinary, flawed human life, yours included. Sit somewhere quiet on Friday, even for 5 minutes. Ask the specific questions, not the vague ones. Write them down if that helps you stay concrete rather than drifting into generality. And then simply pray, Lord, show me plainly what in me still needs your cross. I don't want to hide from it anymore. This is the practice that historically gave the other four their actual weight. Without it, penance risks becoming empty ritual. The stations risk becoming a nice but disconnected devotion. The 3 o'clock pause risks becoming a habit with no substance behind it. And charity risks becoming performative rather than a genuine response to something real that needed addressing. With it, all four of the other practices become what they were always meant to be, a coherent, weekly rhythm of actual conversion, not just observance. So here is everything together before Friday, July 10th, 2026 arrives. Abstain from meat or take up a real costly act of penance in its place. Pray the stations of the cross even briefly, even alone. Pause at 3 o'clock, even for 30 seconds, and let that pause reorient your afternoon. Choose one specific concrete act of charity and actually carry it out. And take a few honest minutes to examine your week in direct light of the Passion, not vaguely, but specifically. None of this requires anything dramatic, and none of it depends on some special, once-a-year feast to give it weight. That's precisely the point. The Church built this rhythm into the ordinary structure of every week, 52 times a year, so that the memory of Christ's Passion would never be allowed to become merely historical, something that happened once a long time ago to someone else. Every Friday is an invitation to make it present again in your own body, your own choices, your own honest self-examination. If any part of this has been useful to you, don't let it end when the video ends. Decide right now which of these 5 you're actually going to do this coming Friday. Not someday. This Friday, July 10th. And if this is the kind of teaching that's helpful to you, subscribe so that when next Friday comes and the one after that, you have something in front of you to return to. Because the whole point of this practice is that it isn't meant to happen once. It's meant to happen every single week for the rest of your life. May the memory of the Passion, kept faithfully week after week, quietly shape the whole of your life toward what it was always meant to become.